Berkeley School of Education. They
Berkeley School of Education. It's my alma mater, and I've already ruined it. They just changed it. Frank serves as faculty director of the school psychology program, the academic talent development program in the California College Preparatory Academy. He's a certified school psychologist and a licensed psychologist. He did his bachelor's and master's at the University of Western Ontario and his doctorate from UC Berkeley, right there, buddy. Sorry,
Go Bears.
And I will say that we're going to find out a lot more about Frank in just a moment, so I thought I'd just dive right in. Just to let you know the format, I'm going to be asking Frank a few questions to get us started. And then after we're done with the prepared questions, we're going to turn it over to you. So if you have a question that you want to ask, you'll raise your hand, and I'll ask Sarah to work with the microphones in the back to make sure that people have the opportunity to ask questions. We're also streaming and recording this event, so we may be checking from time to time to see if other people are coming in on the streaming link. All right, Frank, to get us started, not everybody in our audience is a psychologist. Can you take a moment to tell folks a little bit about psychology, psychologists, and the American Psychological Association?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jeff. And I need to, as we become these roles which have political implications, I need to say that these are my views and not the views of the American Psychological Association. About psychology. Psychology is really the study of mental, at least the definition I learned in undergraduate, the study of behavior and mental processes. And so with that, it covers everything under the sun, in essence. If there's behavior involved, if there's thinking, cognition, or even reflexes involved, it falls under the purview of psychology. So APA is, I think, maybe the largest psychological association in the world. We have something in the order of 134,000 members right now. In the board meeting on Tuesday, I think the chief of membership projected that we may be over 140,000 next year. And AP has 54 divisions, starting with Division 1, which is general psychology, to Division 56, the most recent division, which is trauma psychology. Division 16, for instance, which Jeff and I are both members of, is school psychology, but there's media psychology, there's sport, performance psychology, family psychology, behavioral psychology. So there are a range of specialties, some of them more clinically oriented, some of them more research oriented, and some that, of course, sort of scientist practitioner where people do both. So if you've, those of you in grad school or undergraduate, SATs, GREs, quantitative psychologists are often involved in the development of tests. If you've ever had an IQ test, in a gifted and talented program, they get diagnosed with ADHD, right? So it's really a field that really covers the breadth, and for people who have interest in working, those who are interested in working with people, children or stuff, they're certainly arranged there, but if you're interested in working with animals, right, there's comparative psychology, people who do work with animals in the lab and so forth. So it's, I think, a great field to be in. I stumbled upon it actually as I grew up in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago. We did not have psychology at all, but in my last year of secondary school, a student sort of went a little berserk on stage in a concert and started cursing the principal. And I was going to be a teacher, so I thought maybe I should take a psychology course or two. And so which was a good thing. I left Trinidad because we didn't have psychology at all, even at the university. And that's how I'm here today, because if I had not started down that path, I would never become a psych major eventually, and I wouldn't be here today.
So cursing the principal is a good thing. No, he did not say that.
There was a discussion online a few months ago on the alumni listserv for my school, and apparently that young man became a teacher eventually. So he was not somebody who I knew well, but so somebody said, yeah, they mentioned that, and he became a teacher. So.
Frank, how do psychologists understand diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging?
Right, now that's a loaded question these days, isn't it? I think the underlying principle of psychology is individual differences. We are all coming with different gene sets, except for identical twins. We're coming with different gene sets. We grow up, even when we grow up in the same environments, those of you who have siblings, you know that in fact your parents may treat both of you the same, but you interpret things very differently. And so diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Let's start with the diversity part. So the diversity is a fundamental aspect of human behavior, right? And then so we have humans as individuals, but then individuals belong to groups. There are gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, language, first language. So all of those things are part of what make us who we are. And so in terms of psychology, we need, in fact, to consider all of those aspects when we are thinking about people and recognize that we may be all equal under the law, but we also have a range of differences. At APA, when we are forming committees, forming a committee of 6, I think our diversity matrix has something like 15 or 20 categories, including geographical location in the country and career stage, so graduate student, early career, mid-career, late career. So that's all in fact a base. And so if we are thinking about belonging in the context of that, then we need to recognize that in fact everybody needs to have an opportunity to participate, to feel that they belong in a context. I study ethnic and racial identity is one of the things I study, and it was not something that I thought I would study. But when I came to the US, I went to dinner with some graduate students from Berkeley, and one of them asked me a question which I found a little peculiar, and the question was, do you consider yourself black first or Trinidadian first? And my response was, I'm black and I'm Trinidadian. They're not separate. And I asked the question back, do you consider yourself black first or American first? And he said, oh, I'm black first and American second. That's what got me interested in studying ethnicity and stuff. So, and I think it speaks to the context of growing up in the United States for people of color, right? That in fact, many times they do not feel they belong as much as other groups may feel they belong. And so again, a fundamental premise. So when we are thinking about diversity, we've got to think about belonging as well, because everybody has got to be part of a collective if we're going to move forward and I think solve the problems that we are facing as a nation, as a world today.
Thank you, Frank. The murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement have caused many institutions to reflect on systemic racism and what they can do about it. Could you tell us how APA has responded to that challenge?
Right, thanks. Yeah, and I'd like to begin by saying that I think George Floyd was a catalyst, but it's important to recognize that there are a number of things that were happening all along, and in some sense, so there's socio-historical time moving along, and that perhaps if the George Floyd thing had happened 50 years ago, it would not have had the impact that it had today. So I think that that's an important thing to acknowledge. So when the George Floyd murder occurred, I think there are a number of things that in fact made it much more salient for people more generally. First, we were in the COVID lockdown, and so many people were at home, right? And so consuming more news than they would have. I think the other thing is because COVID represented, I think, to my mind, the first existential threat to us as a species, in a really global sense. We've had pandemics before, but when you think about 190-something countries shutting down, we've not had anything of that scale before, and I think the level of anxiety and stress that people were feeling, I think, was really high, and I think George Floyd's murder then catalyzed, I think, that anxiety. People knew about it, but they were also anxious about other things, and it gave them something to work towards, which is a social justice, the idea that people of African Americans are not, experience a much different environment in the US sometimes than their white peers. And so the president at the time, Sandra Schulman, decided that as president, you get to set initiatives for the association, and she decided that APA has got to work on the issue of systemic racism. It's got to become a fundamental part of the work that psychology and psychologists do moving forward. So she put a task force in place, which she was 2020 president. That led to a resolution that the APA Council, which has to pass all policy, passed in February of 2021 at the 2021 meetings, which was virtual, defining racism, systemic racism, defining in fact levels of racism, individual, collective, systemic, institutional, and so forth, so that to recognize that in fact racism exists on multiple levels. At the same time, the 2021 president, Jennifer Kelly, she was president-elect, she then made the decision that APA was going to apologize for the role that psychology had played in racism over the years. So we've had certainly psychologists, including presidents of APA who are members, who were eugenicists and so forth, who supported discrimination, wrote discriminatory tracts and so forth. So in 2021, the second council meeting, which should have been in August, but was postponed to October so we could do it in person, we actually passed 3 resolutions. One, the apology to people of color for psychology's role in perpetuating, supporting perpetuating racism, not acting. 2, psychology's commitment, or APA's commitment, to engaging with systemic racism and working to end it in our society. And the third one was health equity, which is, of course, Jennifer Kelly, Dr. Kelly, she is a health psychologist, and so this one was put in her area. It's, again, in the same vein, but specifically focused on health equity issues of health equity, because we know that a lot of the issues related to the disparities in health outcomes are related to social determinants of health, including racism. And so those resolutions were passed in October of 2021. I think 2 of them were passed by 100%. I think the health equity one may have gotten 99.9%. I think one person abstained or something like that, and so forth. I was president-elect in 2021, so I was part of these discussions, and I actually decided I was not going to have any major initiatives, but I was going to work to make sure that, in fact, these resolutions then move forward, because things can be passed and then stall. And so in February of this year, at the February meeting in 2022, we actually looked at an audit. We had the APA Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office do an audit of everything that APA was doing related to EDI work. What was it doing and what was the impact? Is there demonstrated impact? And then on the basis of that, the office was asked to develop an action plan moving forward, so that in fact this would be a part of APA's ongoing work, and council approved that action plan in the August meeting of this year. We have allocated about, I think, $1.1 million in funds to jumpstart that initiative. So we're in the process of working to move that forward. But the other thing that we wanted to do is that we wanted to do some stuff immediately, because, as a lot of people say, one can apologize, but, and we can have long-term plans, but what can you do in the short term? And so AP has done a number of things in the short term. Some of these were suggested by the task force, which actually worked on the apology and the dismantling systemic racism resolutions. We started this last year. There are 5 national ethnic psychological associations: the Association of Black Psychologists, the Society of Indian Psychologists, National Latinx Psychological Association, the Asian American Psychological Association, and the Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African Psychological Association. So the APA presidential trio has meetings, individual meetings with those presidential trios. We started them last year. We've had them again this year. The idea will continue into the forward to see how can we, in fact, work. They're much smaller associations than we are. How can we collaborate on these kinds of issues moving forward? We are engaging in difficult dialogues. We don't agree on everything, so we had our first difficult dialogue at the convention this year, where representatives of all these associations were on stage engaging in conversation about what we agree on, what we disagree on, how we can move forward. We are starting a series for psychologists of color, featuring psychologists of color for high school students, that they can show in high school psychology classes. Our editorial office, we publish 89 journals, we are encouraging all of the journals to have EDI policies. We have also instituted an editorial fellowship so that individuals from underrepresented groups can actually get sort of mentored into editing, and so we'll be competitive to be editors of these journals in the future. And so there are a number of these kinds of things. So there are a long list of these kinds of things that we are working on.
Thank you, Frank. And I assume EDI is equity, diversity, and
Equity,
inclusion?
diversity, and inclusion, yes.
Good. Just wanted
Sorry.
Yeah. we all use acronyms. And by the way, when I say APA, I mean the American Psychological Association, just so everyone knows. I guess I want to shift gears a little bit here. You and I are both school psychologists, right, and have scholarly interests and do research in schools. Can you please talk a little bit about your research? In other words, what you've done and do beyond your role as APA president.
Right, yes. Well, all of the writing I'm not getting to do these days, and my co-authors are not very happy with me. So when as I said, I came to psychology. I started off as an English major and psychology minor because I was going to be a secondary school English teacher. And I eventually became a psych major and English minor, and I got a Commonwealth scholarship from Trinidad and Tobago, which is where I'm from, and Canada. So I did my work in Canada, but my junior and senior years were funded by Canada, which was great. I even had for those, no computers in those days. I had a typing scholarship. I could even pay to get my papers typed up. So Canada was very generous. I went back to Trinidad for 2 years because I owed them service on the basis of the scholarship. And I had decided I liked research. When I finished my bachelor's degree, the university offered me a scholarship to do my master's. So I did a master's degree in educational psychology. So I went back to Trinidad after that, and I was in Trinidad for 2 years. And the second year of my service, I served as a principal of a continuation high school, what we'd call a continuation high school in the United States. We don't have that terminology there for students who are kicked out or flunked out of the regular school system. And I got really interested in the idea of at-risk youth and youth who are having trouble in the school system. And so I came to the United States to do my dissertation on dropouts and dropout prevention. And so that's one area of research that I have done, although I don't write as much on dropouts anymore. But in my dissertation work, my dissertation showed that the youth who dropped out of school who were at risk had less hope in the future than the youth who were equally at risk, but who chose to stay in school. So the youth who stayed in school believed that the future was going to work out. Which is, I thought was a really important finding. And so I've done some work in that vein, but a lot of my work then had turned to sort of what are the things that predict resilience in students. And sort of the most recent aspect of that work, I guess, there was a 2016 book that I co-edited with somebody who had been on my dissertation committee when I was at Berkeley, and we became colleagues when I went back to the faculty at Berkeley. UC Berkeley has a charter school partnership. In fact, several of the UC schools do. Our school is called CalPrep, the California College Preparatory Academy. And so we wanted to sort of put our money where our mouth is. And so we actually started a school, a secondary school, grades 6 to 12. And that book sort of details the thinking behind that, what we were trying to do, and takes it through the second graduation class, and stuff. So that's one aspect of the research that I do. Then turning to protective factors, I said, the hope in the future, this idea of believing that the future will work out. So I suppose most people here are psychology or psychology majors, psychologists, may be familiar with Erik Erikson. I love the name. One of my sisters married a Mr. Frank. I tried to get her to name one of her sons after me. She wouldn't. I thought Frank would be a good name. But in any case, Erikson talks about in his psychosocial theory about the stages that individuals go through. And stage one, trust versus mistrust. And for Erickson, of course, adolescence is a really important stage. And in adolescence, the trust versus mistrust becomes time perspective. So hope in the baby becomes time perspective in adolescence. And then he talks about the school age and adolescence, it's anticipation of achievement. And so it seemed to me that there are a number of theoretical perspectives which are speaking to the importance of thinking about time, thinking about the future, positive expectations for the future. And so that's a line of research that has sort of taken off. I've done a few studies on it over the course of my career, the dissertation study and several other studies showing that, in fact, individuals who were at risk, while they may be equally at risk, but the ones who were resilient were the ones who had more hope in the future, anticipation of achievement, expecting to go to college, so sort of future-oriented things. And as if those of you who go into the academics here will understand this, but one's work gets driven by other work in the field. In 1999, Philip Zimbardo, a well-known name in psychology, the Stanford Prison Study, which actually was focused on future as well, to some extent, he published an article in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology introducing an instrument, the Zimbardo Time Perspective Inventory, which excited a lot of us who were doing time work because he argued in that article that we focus on the future and we assume that because somebody is future-oriented, that means they're not present or past-oriented. But that's an assumption that should be tested. And so he published a scale which had 5 time perspectives, as he called them: past positive, past negative, present hedonistic, present fatalistic, and future. And so a student at Penn State, which is where I was at the time, I hadn't seen the article, she brought it to me. She came bearing gifts. This is for students. She came bearing gifts. She was coming to ask me to be on her dissertation committee. And she brought this article with her. And I agreed to be on her committee. And we collected some data on that article on adolescence because the article was on stuff. And the scale didn't work very well. And so this was in around maybe 2003, I believe. A little before that, because I moved to Berkeley actually in 2003. So maybe about 2001. And I went to Berkeley, she graduated, I was on the committee, I stayed on it, she graduated and then came to Berkeley as a postdoc to work with me. And we decided that we were going to develop our own scale since the Zimbardo scale didn't work as well as we'd like it to. And so we now have a scale called the Adolescent and Adult Time Inventory, and that has been taking a lot of my time over the last few years, I think.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Okay. Because it's actually caught on a lot. A lot of people tried the Zimbardo scale and found that it didn't work as well as they'd like. And so then our scale came out, and so it's now been translated into 14 languages, I believe. The most recent publication was in Amharic in Ethiopia. And so I have been publishing Poland, we have an article that just came out in the European Journal of Psychological Assessment on the Polish version. And so that we've been looking at that. But what's been interesting with that work has been, it really has crystallized, I think, the belief that I had. And Zimbardo's also contention was correct. Because what we've been able to do is we've been able to show that adolescents and adults have what we call time attitude profiles. So they are, they may be high and positive in the past, present in the future. That's actually the most adaptive profile. And there are people who are negative about all the time periods. There are people who are more positive about the future, optimists, but they're not that hard on the present and the past, and so forth. And our work has shown that depending on your profile, you have different levels of adaptability. So negatives report much higher stress, for instance, than positives and optimists. But positives report higher self-esteem, higher perspective taking. So in fact, in a study, a recent study, 2019, we actually found that positives were actually reporting perceiving less discrimination. So it seems to be that these profiles are lenses through which one interprets the world, right? And so forth. And in an article that came out this year, we looked at it in gifted and talented students. The groups did not differ. The gifted and people didn't differ among profiles in terms of amount of effort they were doing or how hard they worked and all of that. But they differed in the enjoyment that they had in doing the work. So positives reported enjoying doing the work more, which when the going gets hard is important, right? So these were gifted and talented students. Mean GPA was 3.8. So that's another set of work I've been doing. A third set of work I've been doing is gifted and talented youth. Again, serendipity. I was at Berkeley. I was a foreign student. I needed to pay the rent in the summer. And I couldn't work off campus. I was a foreign student. And Berkeley had a gifted and talented program where they hired teachers. And so I found out about that, and I got involved with that. Summer of 1989, my first summer in the United States. I started my PhD program in August of '88. And I've been involved with that program ever since. I'm now the faculty director of that program, the Academic Talent Development Program. And in fact, I do work on gifted and talented youth. And I think importantly on theorizing about what gifted and talented is, because I think there's this belief that giftedness is an endowment, you're born gifted and so forth. But we changed our name to the Academic Talent Development Program because we believe that talent has to be developed. And so with two colleagues, we have a model called the Talent Development Mega Model, where we talk about all the aspects that make up, that lead to talent development, including opportunities, right? Providing opportunities to individuals. Now, individuals then have to take advantage of those opportunities, but there are many individuals who don't get the opportunities in the first place, and so their talents don't get to develop. And so that's another set of work I do. And the other sort of substantive work I mentioned, ethnic and racial identity, I was studying dropouts, the achievement gap, opportunity gap, whichever I think they're both. They're achievement gaps and opportunity gaps. You can't be studying dropouts and not be looking at people of color in the United States versus, Asian Americans, European Americans are doing on average better than African Americans, Latin Americans, and so forth, Native Americans. And so a lot of the two seminal theories in that area, one is stereotype threat, Claude Steele, psychological. The other one is cultural ecological theory, was by a Nigerian anthropologist. He's passed away now. He was on the Berkeley faculty, John Ogbu. And even though he's an anthropologist, I think his theory is actually a psychological theory because it speaks to identity and identifying as a student, as a scholar, and those kinds of things. And the reason why many people who are from what he called involuntary minority groups, sort of push away mainstream society because of the way they're treated and so forth. And so identity then became very clear that an identity was a variable that was important to study, and so that I started studying ethnic and racial identity, and starting with racial identity actually first with African Americans. And the seminal identity theorist in Black identity is William E. Cross Jr. He just turned 82 this year, Negrescence theory. First version of it published in 1971 when he was in grad school. The seminal theory that has, it's nice when you publish a piece in grad school, it gets cited by everybody else for the next 50 years. I started, when I got to Penn State, he and I got to Penn State at the same time. I was a first-year assistant professor in school psychology, and he came in social and personality. And so then we started to work together in 1995, and so we have published a scale, cross-racial identity scale, which operationalizes Negrescence theory. It's the most recent operationalization of that. And more recently, I took the lead because a number of my colleagues were saying, we need a scale like this for people who are not Black. And so in 2019, we published the first version of the cross-ethnic racial identity scale, adult, which can be used with European Americans, African Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, and so forth. And in fact, we have a youth version. I have some data that we are working on right now from the US that I haven't had a chance to write up, and my colleagues are upset with me. We also have found that it works in New Zealand, which has the Maori, the Pacifica, Asian and white. So that's another set of work I've been doing. And overlaying all of this is scale development. You've been hearing I'm developing scales. We have a construct. We need to be able to measure it. So I've been doing scale development work. So I've been keeping a little busy over the last few years. So.
Yeah, it sounds like you are keeping yourself busy. That I think we can all agree on. My last question for you is, what role do school psychologists have or should have in helping pre-K-12 schools enhance diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging for all students?
I think school psychology has a critical role to play, but I think, and I know we often start with DEI, DEIB, JB. I think the fundamental issue, justice issue in the school context is these opportunity gaps, these achievement gaps. We need to find ways so that students to equalize the distributions of performance of students. I think one of the things we know is that students enter schools with a small gap, and the gap gets wider in achievement as throughout schooling. And it has profound implications for graduating from high school, for going on to college, for getting into a job that's a profession, and so forth. So I think that the things that we are doing are really, the fundamental aspect for us is to get schooling right, which we have not yet. And that needs to be our number one thing. In the context of doing that, I don't think you can do that if you don't teach that, all people are created equal with the same inalienable rights, right? That in point of fact, that then, right, and that's one of the reasons why everybody should be getting a quality education. But the nature of the problems that we currently face as a society, and I'll use COVID-19 as a case in point. COVID-19 became a political football when it was a mental health, not a mental health, a physical health problem. We are still losing actually over 30,000 people a day. It's out of the news, but it is still killing over 30,000 people a day. There are people here who are wearing their masks. But when masks were mandatory, there are many people who did not wear masks, who refused to wear masks, who refused to get vaccinated simply because they didn't believe. And I grew up in the church, so I understand the importance of belief, but there is also evidence. And, and stuff, and this was an evidence-based issue, right? And so we now live in a world where, in fact, where facts are no longer accepted by everybody. And so I think another aspect of what we need to be doing in schools is teaching, we've got to teach critical thinking. People have got to be able to examine evidence and come to logical and reasoned conclusions and about things like medicine and disease and not be going on belief. And I think that that's another really important thing that we need to be doing. To do that, of course, it means we need to train our teachers and our administrators to engage appropriately with all of the students that they're dealing with. There's a special issue in learning and instruction that I just wrote a commentary on, and the question is who will teach the teachers? And I think in some sense that's part of what our task is as school psychologists and academics in education. To, the issue of implicit bias and in fact students getting treated differentially and those kinds of things. So all of those things I think are part of a role that we have to play. My fundamental belief is that education is much more important for those who have less opportunities, less resources. So public education is much more important for those individuals. I am sitting here before you because of a good public education. We didn't have a lot of money, and my parents made it very clear, we don't have a lot of money to leave you. But we can make sure that you go to school and you learn what you need to learn. And then that will serve you for the rest of your life, and it has. And I think we need to do that for every segment of our society. And education is not just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Yes, it is. But it is about opening up a possibility of a future, right? I never thought I'd be living outside the United States. I have 3 siblings, there are 4 of us. 3 of us live in the United States, right? I have friends, friends who went to school with me. One is in Toronto, one is in New York. They're all over the place. They're in New York, right? But again, it came because of education. Our task is to broaden the vision of kids so that they can do the things that they have the skill sets to do and that they want to do, that they're passionate about. And I think every kid doesn't have that opportunity. So I think at the fundamental level, that's school psychology as the profession that focuses on mental processes and behavior. That is, I think, our calling to serve that well. And I talked about this, but I want to make it more explicit. I dabble in music. And the musical South Pacific talks about hate. You have to be carefully taught to hate, to not like people whose eyes are a different shape and whose skin is a different color. That needs to be a fundamental part of our education system as we go forward, that we are all moving forward together as equals into this new world where we are not going to solve climate change and COVID-19 and the Florida situation right now. So everybody is sort of Florida, but it's similar. Pakistan is in a similar position at the same time. Our problems now are not just national, they're global. And so we need to be thinking about these solutions, because the hurricane is not going to stop at the borders of the United States like it doesn't, and COVID-19 doesn't stop at the borders. These things, we now need to work together across the world to solve these problems.
Well, thank you, Frank. I think at this point, I would like to open it up to the audience, and I would like to see if anyone has questions. And I'm going to ask you, Frank, do you want to take questions one at a time, or do you want to have people ask a few questions and then respond en masse?
Well, let's see how it goes. I think we have some time. So
I'm going to ask Sarah to get a microphone, a handheld microphone, and if you would like to ask a question of Dr. Worrell, please raise your hand. I see someone all the way in the back over there.
Hi. Oh. We're very loud. I'll hold it out here. So thank you for your talk and for your time. I really appreciate it. I am from developmental psychology, and of course we're very interested in education and education equity broadly. I'm curious, given your role in APA and your knowledge of school psychology, if there are ways that APA can use its large presence to advocate for education equity in the US or elsewhere, and if so, what are some ways that you might do that?
Right. I think we are trying. The way APA is designed is we have sort of directorates, and one of the directorates we have is an education directorate. And so, for example, while a lot of the work of the education directorate focuses on graduate education and undergraduate, so we have principles for high school psychology, undergraduate psychology, graduate psychology, we accredit doctoral programs in health service psychology and so forth. We also have a group that focuses more on K-12. It's called the Coalition for Psychology in the Schools and Education. And so that group is made up, it's an interdivisional coalition. I think it's made up of representatives from about 20 different divisions, right? They send a representative, and it has ongoing projects that it's working on. So one of the things that it has done that's gotten a lot of traction has been, it identified the top 20 principles for teachers, right? And so, and that work, that's another thing that's been translated into about 20 or 25 different languages, because, so, what are the sort of the most important psychological principles that the teachers and educators need to know? They've done some work during COVID-19 with the CDC. I'm not quite familiar with what it is, but I do know they had a CDC contract. And so there are a number of things. And so that's certainly a group one. If you have an idea that it's something that they should work on, you can certainly email and suggest it. But because the ideas typically come out from the group, I am actually currently working on, again, my co-author's upset with me, we're working on a book on motivation. It came out of that. We had done a project on motivation for teachers and stuff, and so a number of us are doing a book on motivation. For instance, when is competition helpful versus when is it harmful? Because there are some assumptions that it's always harmful, for instance. Some assumptions it's always helpful, and of course, things are always more nuanced. And so things like that are going to be in that book. So, so that's one of the things. We also, of course, when things like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, mental health in schools, APA does a lot of lobbying. Right now, there's only a certain amount of lobbying. Let me be clear here so I don't get into trouble. APA's tax status is 501c3, which means it's a limited amount of lobbying it can do, but it has a partner organization, APA Services, Inc., which is a 501c6. So every member who joins APA, some of their dues go to APA, and some of them, their dues go to APA Services, Inc. APA Services, Inc. does a fair amount of lobbying so we reach out, and not just on mental health issues, but on sort of general education issues, right? So we've been doing a lot of things about, that there need to be prevention, that in fact, you need to have mental health services in schools, not just to deal with stress and anxiety, but in fact, so that in fact, students, in fact, if we can inoculate students and engage in prevention, they are actually going to be able to be more educated, right? So we do those kinds of things. We provide commentary on bills that are coming before Congress, right? So there's a lot of things. We recently took out, with the shooting, the Uvalde and the Buffalo had happened, and then Uvalde happened in the school. And of course, AP has spoken out about that before, but when the Uvalde shooting happened, one of the things I suggested, because politicians, I think, listen to many voices, and 130,000 members may sound like a lot, but in the political sphere, that's not really that much. And so we actually took out an ad in USA Today, a one-page ad, which based on my suggestion, where we also included the National Association of School Psychologists, National Association of Social Workers, and so forth. And so we had 9 organizations that signed this ad calling on Congress to act. And the limited gun legislation that got passed shortly thereafter, we were asked to comment on that. And when we sent in our comments, supported by 59 other organizations. So we did partnerships. And so those are the kinds of things that we have been doing as well. So we are doing, they're not always visible, right? Those things happen and one doesn't always see it. But there's always work going on in this space.
Yeah, if I could actually add to that, I was chair of the Committee on Psychological Tests and Assessments for a few years. This was some years ago. And at that time, educational testing was very big because the Bush administration had pushed through testing in grades 3 through 12. And we worked very closely with a number of Senate and congressional offices to try and help them understand how legislation could be used appropriately, but could also be used inappropriately with areas in which there's expertise. And as Frank said, my goodness, APA is so broad. There are so many people who have that, but I liken it to a duck, right? Very busy under there, but you don't see it so much on the surface.
Right. And for those of you who are graduate students who are close to finishing, for example, we have a congressional fellowship program where early to mid-career PhDs can apply and get to go work with a member of Congress. And so one of my former postdocs is actually, I'm not sure I can't remember who he decided to go and work with, but the Senate and stuff. And basically I told him, what do you want to do legislation on? So that's something for those of you who are interested in policy to keep in mind as you move into your careers.
Do we have another question?
Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your time and your thoughts. I'm thinking about APA as such a huge organization where I'm sure there's bureaucracy and wheels of change turning slowly, right. And yet I hear you saying in the last few years, you're making short-term change and progress, and you're doing long-term planning. And I'm wondering if you have kind of lessons learned or tips or challenges that as a department, as we're thinking about how can we promote this sort of equity and justice and belonging, what can we learn from your experiences?
Right. I think there are a couple things that we've learned along the way. I think that it is really important to get as many voices to the table as possible. And so in the course, for example, of developing the action plan that was passed by Council in August, we shared the audit with Council. We then had a series of sessions, and we actually brought together a group of experts on equity, diversity, inclusion for a summit to review, then modify the plans based on that, and then did a broad, we did a, Zoom now allows you to reach to a broad number of people. So we reached out to a lot of individuals within and beyond the organization to get their input. And I think that that is one really key. For instance, when we were doing the apology, one of the things we did with the apology, you can find it on the APA website, is a chronology of the harms that psychology has done over the years. But we also, as part of that, we actually had listening sessions with members of different ethnic racial groups, right? So, you know, again, and stuff. And one of the things I've been trying to stress, as president, you chair the council the year you are there, and I've been very clear that this is not about kicking people out from the center. I think, you know, there's this rhetoric now that if you're concerned about the issues of black people or Latinx people, you're no longer concerned about the issues of white people and that kind of thing. That this is not about excluding, bringing in new people and excluding ones who were there before. This is about bringing everybody into the center, right? So I think that that's important. Acknowledging that a majority, sometimes you're going to make decisions based on values and then democratically on votes. So in February, one of the things we passed that upset some members of council and some members of APA was a commitment to reproductive rights for women. We try not to get into the politics of these issues. We speak on the science, and one of the things our policy spoke to was the fact that when you look at things like anxiety, stress, depression, and so forth, women who have had abortions are actually often have better mental health than ones who can't have them, and so forth, both in the short and long term. So we spoke to the science. That's what we try to ground our policies in. Certainly, we have a Division 36, which is psychology of religion. The current representative from that division was one of the members of council who could not support that resolution. He voted against it. But he went to the mic, and one of the things he said, I think, you know, I'm glad I can be heard, that my points of view can be heard, because even though I don't think my point of view is going to prevail, I'm glad that in fact people are listening to it and at least considering it. And I think that's what we can try to do. I think that's really where we are. We're never, I think, going to get to a position where we have 100% agreement on everything in most times. But I think if we can consider everybody's perspective and try to include as many of those perspectives in our decision making as possible, that's the way to go. And I guess the one more piece on this, and we are still working on this, is how do you do this and get people who have different points of view to listen to each other and not demonize each other? So the APA, we are actually having that as a discussion at our board retreat next week. That's one of our topics of discussion. How do we recognize and support diverse perspectives, you know, in a context where everybody doesn't agree with each other? That's critically important in a society like ours. And I think over the last 5-6 years, we have gotten, I think, less able to do that. I'm at Berkeley, which has a historical commitment to free speech. And even there are people who are trying to shut down some points of view. They don't want them on campus and so forth. And our message as the faculty to many of the students is that you've got to be able to engage with points of view that are different from yours. You don't have to agree, but you've got to be able to engage with. Because you're not going to ever be able to come to conclusion, even if it's a compromise conclusion, if you cannot speak to the other person.
I see two here in the front row. Go over here first. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about bringing in diverse viewpoints and kind of the difficulty that comes along with that, because I feel that, you know, very often the sort of range of backgrounds that people come from in psychology and the backgrounds of, you know, people who aren't involved in those sorts of conversations can be limited. And I wanted to ask about how, or the long-term processes for, you know, getting in sort of a wider variety of people that come from different backgrounds, whether that be, you know, poor backgrounds, different races, you know, all of that stuff. So just about the difficulty of establishing more diversity.
Right. I think your point is well taken. For example, I would suspect, we don't collect these data, that the majority of APA members are probably left of center. You know, but one of the things that we have tried to do when we have these listening sessions is we actually reach out. I mean, we have psychologists who live in every state in the nation. And I have to tell you, after we did our ad in the US News about gun violence, I mean, I got emails saying, people don't kill people, guns kill people, right? So from psychology members who did not agree with, you know, and stuff. So one of the things we really do try to do within APA when we're doing is we reach out beyond APA membership. So that's one of the things we actively try to do. When we did our strategic plan in 2019, we did the same thing, right? Because it's important to get perspectives that go beyond psychology, you're right. Because we have made a commitment to a field, and so we may be coming more similar than different. So it's important to get other voices, right? The APA Task Force on Violence Against Educators is meeting the first week in November. And we are inviting National Education Association, National Association of Social Workers, National Association of School Psychologists, right? So it's school-based, but these are, again, other associations that go beyond what we have and who bring different perspectives, right? Teachers and so forth. So I think that that's important to do. You can reach some people and not reach others. I actually accepted an invitation to speak earlier this year. And I have to preface this by saying I'm not sure if I knew how different it was going to be that I would have accepted it. I'm glad I didn't, because I'm glad I went. I accepted an invitation to speak at on talent development at a summit, which turned out to be the major meeting for Republican donors. The keynote speakers at that event were Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, you know, Tim Scott, I think. There are a number of these people, right, and stuff. Now, I'm an independent, right? So I was going to speak on talent development, right? But I mean, somebody said to me, "You're a professor?" I said, "Yes, we're Berkeley." And they said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry for you," right? So there were perspectives there that were very, very different from many of the perspectives that I held. I arrived there on a Thursday afternoon, and one of the first things I did in my room was to approve a press release that APA we were sending out supporting the rights of LGBTQ youth. And later that day and the next day, there were a number of comments that were not in support of the rights of LGBTQ youth and stuff. And I'm thinking, well, they haven't seen my press release yet, have they? But you know, the thing about, but it was important to be there and to bring a voice to be there. And to their credit, they didn't have a lot, but they did bring in a couple Democrats to argue with. So there are a number of Democratic members. There are, I think, 2 or 3 Democratic members of the House who were also in attendance, even though the majority were Republicans. And so the thing about it is, I think what we try to do as AP is, what can we agree on? We are not going to agree on everything, but can we find things that we agree on? And at least, for the moment, we can work on those things. And the things we don't agree on, we can, you know, we can leave those off the table for the moment.
Did you have a question? Sarah, could you get the microphone? Thanks.
Hi, thank you for being here. I had a question about something you said before. You mentioned that when you think of diversity, you have to think of belonging to, and how in schools, a way to quote unquote get schooling right is to focus on critical thinking. So my question is, for a lot of topics we're going over today, like COVID-19, social justice movements, they've kind of taken a turn of being political. How can we practice critical thinking in schools or implement that in a creative way without stepping on political toes?
So I think the idea is not to avoid stepping on political toes, but to not demonize people because they disagree with you. So at the meeting I was at, there were people at my table, and there was a couple, and the husband said he think he got COVID-19 from the vaccine. That he was fine, then he got the vaccine, then he got it. So he is convinced he got it from the vaccine. You know, and he doesn't know of anybody who's died of from COVID-19 anyway. And I said, well, I lost my brother-in-law. One of my students lost a grandfather. We have lost several psychologists who were a husband and wife couple. She was on the board of directors with me. I said, so I know a number of people have died from it, and I have gotten the vaccine and I have not gotten it. So that your perspective, there are other perspectives. So the idea though is not, I'm not angry, right? But what I'm saying is that in fact, I'm able to offer a different perspective that at least he will hear, right? And what I have discovered is, I mean, I think when we get into shouting matches, then we get into these places where people can't hear each other. So sometimes you need to take a deep breath because their perspective is such that it really does could potentially offend you. But if you want to engage in dialogue, you've got to put that aside and think about the greater good, right? So when I am teaching, right, I may be teaching something that some students do not agree with or do not understand, they don't know. If I am actually saying, I'm never going to listen to you, you need to hear what I say and shut up, I'm not going to reach those students, right, and stuff. I actually need to hear their position and explain my position calmly and rationally and stuff. One of the things that the dropout prevention literature tells us, actually, is that many students who are not doing well in school while they're in high school, for example, and the teachers that they remember the most, when they get it together at age 25 or 30, they get it together on the basis of some of those same teachers they did not listen to, right? The ones who were rational and so forth and who were saying, you need to think about this a different way, right? And so that sometimes the message may not be heard in the moment, but if, you know, I believe the message will be heard eventually, you know, and so forth. So that's my approach to this. And I'm sure there are others, right? There, you know, no magic bullets here, unfortunately. Or in Harry Potter, no wands, right? Or potions.
I see a hand up back there.
This one, actually, this young lady has been trying to get in
I'm
for the
sorry,
longest while.
I have not seen, thank you, Frank. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Sorry. Okay. So I and a few of us here are research assistants in the Teen Health Lab, which focuses on like parent to child like sexual communication, and particularly at like the teen age. So as a school
Question that I wish I had an answer to. I think when we get into these areas of belief versus evidence, in many cases, belief often trumps evidence. In fact, social psychology tells us that once we believe something, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, it's very, very difficult for that belief to change. And so what happens is what you're working on is not that it's not possible, but you need to be thinking of it in terms of years rather than in terms of weeks and months. Because, you know, so that in fact, it's a longer term strategy, right? If you think about, I think, gay marriage is a case in point. When I was growing up, right, the idea of gay marriage was just anathema to practically everybody, even people who supported LGBTQ rights. Now, your generation, it's not a big deal, right? I have students who come in to interview male students talk about their husbands and female students talk about their wives. years ago, that would just never have happened. So, but I think again, it was time, and again, being present, right? So I think, you know, in the media and so forth, just being present in a number of places, the message and the belief systems evolve. And I think, you know, so, you know, the Pope has made a comment, for example, now, you know, that in fact, you know, I think the Catholic Archbishop of San Francisco didn't want to give Nancy Pelosi communion, and the Pope gave her communion. So he's making a very visible statement as head of the Catholic Church that you should not be putting these things together, that they're different systems. So I would say keep doing your work and use psychology. One of the aspects of psychology, there's something called, I think, the Coalition for Psychology in the Schools and Education is working on something of the psychology of persuasion, right? What we do in advertisements and so forth, those kinds of things communicate messages. Build those messages into the work you do, right? So that's what I can say, and recognize it's going to take time. You're welcome.
And before I call on anyone else, Frank, was there someone else that I missed?
No. I just happened because she's right in front of me, and so she's been doing a little, you know, been a little timid about the hand raising and stuff. So. But yeah, I'm glad I saw you, so thank you.
I don't want this too close to my face. Thank you for coming, sir. And as I'm listening to your responses to everyone and the initiatives that the APA is moving forward, I think about this from my perspective as a Latino biostatistician of clinical trials. I think it was 2008, the Division 5 of the APA produced a report from a task force about the need for increasing quantitative psychologists. And in that report, there were two primary findings that were found. One, the general trend that statistical questions that are being asked by psychologists has been on the rise, while the statistical education of them has been kind of, you know, decreasing. And the other is the need for diversifying quantitative psychologists in that particular division, right? It's primarily comprised of statisticians that are, you know, primarily white and male. And so my question to you today, sir, is kind of twofold. One, kind of how, in a time where public trust in social scientific findings is kind of rocky, how the APA may approach kind of bolstering the findings that are a result of the initiatives that you've discussed today, and then twofold, how the APA may consider like efforts to bolster the diversity of quantitative psychologists today.
Right. Let me start with the second one first, about diversifying Division 5. I'm a member of Division 5, by the way. I've been for many years. APA is working, I think, more on diversifying the profession more generally. But like everything else, and it is more diverse now than it was 10 years ago. These are things that take place in historical time, and I think what happens is, now that we have access to information so readily, we often want things to take place in 1 or 2 years, right? But to diversify, to get more people in Division 5, we need to have more PhD psychologists, we need to have more people who graduate from the undergraduate psychology degree, more people who go in. Yeah, so there's a broader, there's a larger strategy, which is one of the reasons we have in our high school standards, Division 5 comments, and so high school psychology courses now talk about effect sizes and those kinds of things, right? So we are trying to provide the education more broadly, but also, so that's one of the things. But the other thing I think that has to happen, right? We are social creatures, you know, so when I walk into a room, to come to that belonging question, right? If I walk into a room and I'm the only black person in that room, I notice, right? Not because I want to notice, but I noticed, right? Race is a salient part, you know, race ethnicity is a salient part of our being, right? And so areas that don't have a lot of people of color, for example, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? Because I have students saying, well, I want to go into that field, but I don't want to go in that field right now because there are not a lot of people of color. And I'm like, well, if you never go into that field, right? When I was a graduate student, we had a graduate student strike at Berkeley, right? And one of the things they were striking about is they wanted more faculty members of color. And I was going to campus, and they said, "You're going into campus?" I said, "Yes." "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to work on my dissertation." "Well, we are striking for more faculty members of color." I said, "And if we don't graduate, who is going to be those more faculty?" So I think one of the things, and I say this to my doctoral students of color, sometimes you've got to be the first, right? If there's not a first, there's not going to be a second. One of my presidential columns this year was called "A Nation of First." I talked about Ketanji Brown Jackson. I talked about Barack Obama and stuff. There's got to be a first, and somebody's got to step into that space. And if somebody doesn't step into that space, it's not going to happen. All right? I mean, what's interesting, like this year, APA has, for the first time, a black presidential trio. The past president is black, I'm black, right? I'm a gay black male. The council leadership team chair is a gay male. These are invisible identities, but I've made it explicit with his permission as well, because representation matters. And so people have got to see us in those spaces, and we've got to encourage people, right? The third thing is, it's one of the reasons I study ethnic and racial identity, and I do quantitative work in that space. Because I think for many people of color, they do qualitative work, and they think that that's the way they can do that kind of work, right? Because they want to study people who look like themselves. But I can show them, they can come and work with me and do quantitative work in that space, right? So and the first part of your question, remind me again.
So I got to remember it too. The value of the statistics that come from studies as a result of the initiatives proposed.
Right. I think when I was a secondary school teacher, my teaching subjects were English and history, right? And I think that's been a useful thing for me, because I think of things in the context of historical time. I think we are in a period where belief, and not just belief, but what I believe specifically, not even general belief as in belief systems, but individual beliefs are seen as when we are giving a talk, I may talk about something, but then I give an example, right? But the example is just to instantiate the larger finding that I have. Now what's happening is, like, the examples become the major thing, and the larger finding is irrelevant. And I think we're in a time period where that's happening a lot. I think it's going to shift. I think these things shift. We are continuing to work on it, and ultimately, the Division 5, I was the first chair. They didn't have a diversity committee. I was its first chair when back in 2007, something like that. So there are things that are going on that we are actually trying to encourage people to do these kinds of things. But that's, and quantitative psychology is really important. And by the way, there are fewer people getting trained in quantitative psychology, but one of the reasons that we are not seeing them, because they are there, is because they're not coming into academia. They are Google and Facebook, and because they're making much more money than they're making as an academic. So we have some, so we're still training some of them. It's just that they're going to work in different places. And one of the things we at AP are trying to do is to encourage psychologists more broadly to go into different spaces, not just the Google and Facebook. We need more psychologists in Congress. We need them in different places, right, with our training, because we need them where the policymakers are, and we need them in the school boards, and we need them in these places where decisions are made. So yeah, your point's well taken. Again, we are trying, but it's a slow process.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. All right, so we'll do you, and then we'll do Scott. Okay. So let me get you the microphone. By the way, folks, this is being streamed on go.ncsu.edu/psychtalk, all one word, PSYCHTALK. I'm gonna, while you're asking the question, Sarah, I just tried to check on my phone. I couldn't see if there were questions coming in. Could you check that real quick? And please go ahead with your question.
Okay, so I apologize. I'm not from like a psychological background. I have like
No apology necessary.
limited knowledge, but you were speaking of like belief systems and APA's sort of commitment to that in institutional psychology. So I'm wondering, what is the APA's standpoint on what defines a person of color? For example, we always use BIPOC as like an acronym, so Black, Indigenous, People of Color, but I think a lot of the time Middle Eastern, Arab, DAISY members are grouped into the white American category, as we've seen on like the US Census. And I feel like I remember learning about how the APA works with the census to gather data in order to further research. So taking data from the US Census that classifies such a large amount of non-white, in my opinion, people into the white American category, you know, that kind of alters data. So what is the APA's commitment to diverting from that, not bias, but almost untrue statistic?
Well, I think you're asking an interesting question, because I think this is one of the areas where there is not consensus, right? And so if we were to go back in history, right? Remember, originally there used to be sort of three groups: white, black, and Asian, right? Those were, so, you know, when we thought about race as a biological construct, right? That's right. Things become more nuanced as we've moved forward, right? So for example, this is really determined in a large part by sort of social construction. So for example, in the context of the United States, September 11th, 2001, actually can be sort of a marker for when sort of people of Arab descent sort of became people of color in a general sense, right? Because much of this was determined by phenotype and those kinds of things, right? And so I don't think that AP has an official definition of people of color. In doing the apology group, I will say that what Dr. Kelly did is she included on the task force, there was somebody from a Native American, African American, Latina, Arab American, so she included the panel P. Now, I will say that she got into trouble. Jews actually wanted to be included, and she said no. Her group, she delimited, right? APA doesn't have an official thing. So, and I do think, as I said, there's now one of the ethnic psychological associations, Arab, Middle Eastern, and North African. So it's considered an ethnic psychological association. That's how they frame themselves, and APA meets with them and sees them that way. So that's the thing. One of the big things that, in fact, what we are trying to do at APA now is to make sure that what we do is that we actually make them visible, because these groups are small, and Native Americans had the same complaint that they are often, when the numbers are small, they often didn't get reported because you couldn't do statistics on them and stuff, and so you'd have an asterisk saying, too small for any calculations. But both Native Americans, Arab Americans, and stuff have asked us, please, even if it's 3, we want the number to be there. We need to be able to track our growth and those kinds of things. So, but the people of color, as I said, question is really an interesting one. I don't think there's a one right answer. And I will say the term BIPOC. If you look at anything I write, you'll see that I do not use the term, and I'll tell you why. People of color was a term that was much more general. And then more recently, we started using BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color. I was meeting with a group, the largest ethnic group in California is Latino, right? They're 52% of our school system. And I was meeting with some Latinx high school students, and they said, we have become third place because we are still in the people of color, but Black and Indigenous have been put ahead of us. Why is that? That's the question they asked me, and I did not have an answer. And that was the last time I used that phrase. Now, different groups have different histories in this country. Of course, blacks had slavery, we took land from Mexicans and so forth. But I really do think that I think one of the greatest threats we face as a society today is that as we come to terms with the history of this country, which we know some politicians don't want to acknowledge, but as we come to terms with the history, as we look back, we can't, I think, allow the anger that you feel at some of the things that happened and still happen to split us further, because we are going to have to come together to move forward. So that's, I may not be a satisfactory answer, but that's the best I can give.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Again, Frank, it's so great to see you. Thanks for coming. I had a question. It was something you were talking about with education, and I just sort of wanted you to elaborate a little bit on it. But the thing about the opportunity gap and what we're trying to do in schools, and germane to school psychologists. But I wonder if you'd also sort of speak to policies about discipline, and of course with your work with dropouts and stuff, just talk a little bit more about that.
Right. So I think all of these speak to opportunities in interesting ways, right? I mean, the discipline gap that you are referencing, for example, we know, I mean, there's compelling evidence now from some of our colleagues that Black students and Latinx students will get sort of suspended for an infraction that white and Asian students who will do the same thing don't get expelled for, right? So all of those things, I mean, speak to the sort of, right, opportunities, right? And the way we engage with individuals, right? So opportunities for a quality education, and if you are excluding kids from school more arbitrarily than, some more arbitrarily than others, they're losing opportunities. I really think it's really important that we teach our teachers and our administrators to sort of be always self-monitoring and to have systems that allow them to monitor. Because we do make mistakes. I mean, I remember my one year as a teacher, I had said to my students, trying to be equitable, that, I will always be fair, and if you think I'm not being fair, you have the right to tell me, right? And I was teaching, we have secondary schools in Trinidad, so go from 12 to 18. And I walked into a class from a faculty meeting, and the faculty had I was very upset. And in Trinidad at the time, I don't know if they still do it anymore, but anytime a teacher walked into a class or left the classroom, students had to stand. And so, and they can't sit till you tell them to sit, right? So I walked into the class, they stood up. I was pissed, not with them, I was pissed with some of my colleagues. And I started writing on the board, right? And so they started to sit, and I looked around and said, did I say to sit? And so they straightened up, and then I heard a voice say, excuse me, sir. I said, what? What do you want? You said we could tell you anytime we thought you were being unfair. Ding! And I'm glad I said it, right? He called me on it. I'm glad he had the courage to do it, and I apologized and stuff. I was wrong in that moment. And I think what we need to do is we need to create spaces for students to be able to do that, and stuff. But we need to create places where teachers actually are looking at themselves all the time. Be it with education, be it with discipline, be it with who gets, in the old days it was who gets to erase the, erase the board and go outside and do the dusters. I mean, I'm dating myself here. But I really do think, I mean, one of the points I make, right, is talent development. We want to develop everybody's talents. I'm willing to bet that the 44th President of the United States and the 45th President of the United States, I'm willing to bet that their teachers did not see a future president sitting before them, right? Our task is to act as if, as educators, as everybody in front of us has the possibility of becoming a president, a nuclear physicist. That's our task, right? In our talent development mega model, one of the things we talk about in the 2004 Olympics, the United States was represented in fencing, which is a very esoteric sport. I don't know, how many people here have held an AP? Anybody? Okay, 2 people, right? The United States was represented in fencing by African American and Latinx adolescents from Harlem. How did that happen? Well, a retired, Olympic fencer retired and bought a brownstone in Harlem. Some parents said to their kids, You have a lot of energy. You're not going to hang with those kids at the corner and get in trouble. Go do here. It's a talent they would never have known they had, right? Except for this strange set of circumstances. And that's what education is about. It's providing those opportunities for kids to develop any of the possibilities that they have. And in the education context, that's reading, writing, arithmetic, but fair play and a lot of other things, right? A sense of possibility. That's what I think when I talk about that. And so that applies across the board from discipline to education, right? The full range.
So folks, I would like to thank all of you for being here. I especially want to give a shout out to the Department of Psychology and Dr. Mayhorn for supporting this request for Frank to join us. I especially want to thank you, Frank. I know how busy you are, and to not only participate with us, but to actually come in person, I think speaks volumes about your character and not the blackmail that I have on you, right?
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I think it's important to note I'm a great believer in giving back, and I am in here today in part because of Jeff. When he actually offered, when I was finishing up grad school, to look at my letters where I was applying for faculty positions. And I sent him my letters, and he wrote back to me and he said, no, this British stiff upper lip thing is not going to work. You need to sell yourself. And he gave me pointers about how to, ways to sell myself without being cheap, kind of thing. But I really do think that it's important. One of the things I will say that surprised me at the APA convention this year was that LGBTQ youth, foreign students, international students, black people, everybody, a lot of people were seeing themselves in me, right? That they could be president of APA. And I think, and so in that spirit, the president-elect, Tamar Bryant, who's also African-American, she's doing a thing called Representation Matters, and she's actually interviewing people from historically underrepresented, psychologists from historically underrepresented groups who've become leaders. That's going to be, she's creating a video series that's going to be on the APA website. So I think that's going to be a great thing to again, speak to people and to the possibilities and taking advantage of opportunities. So thank you for coming here today. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Worrell. Thank you, Jim. Really appreciate it.